Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. We are really absolutely delighted today to have as our guest Kgalema Motlanthe, the former president of South Africa. Before I introduce him, let me say a few words for those of you who don't know about the U.S. Institute of Peace. The U.S. Institute of Peace is a congressionally created organization dedicated to the prevention and the mitigation and the overcoming of conflict. The institution works around the world in places like Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Central African Republic, Nigeria, and a lot of other places, working with the communities of activists and peace activists around the world, training, bringing solutions, working together, trying to overcome the problems of conflict and to prevent conflict from breaking out. So we're very glad you're here with us today. And as I said, we are very pleased and very honored to have our guest today. Kgalema Motlanthe, the former president of South Africa, was a very early activist in the fight against apartheid. He was a student activist, he was a trade unionist, he was a member of the ANC's military wing during that period, and he paid a price. He was arrested in 1976 and kept in detention for 11 months. And then in 1977, he was found guilty of 3 crimes under the Terrorism Act and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment on Robben Island, along with Nelson Mandela and many other leaders of the anti-apartheid movement. After his release from Robben Island from 1977-1987, after his release, he was elected Secretary General of the National Union of Mine Workers. Many of you know it was one of the premier black unions in South Africa, and he was elected Secretary General of the ANC in 1997. Between September 25th, 2008 and May 9th, 2009, he was president of South Africa. And then, after the end of his presidency, he became deputy president, and he served in that position until May 2014. Currently, he is chairman of the Lily Leaf, I always have a hard time to, Lily Leaf Trust, as well as the Kgalema Motlanthe Foundation. I'll say a word about the Lily's Leaf Trust because it is an organization which has preserved the documents and the history of the anti-apartheid movement and has brought that history to new generations in South Africa, to visitors from around the world. I had the pleasure of attending a very fine conference there just a year ago, and it's really quite an important organization in South Africa. Mr. President, today South Africa is currently undergoing both a political and an economic crisis. There is much speculation about where it's heading. And this is in one of the world's strongest democracies. So we are particularly pleased to have you here. President Motlanthe is now today recognized as one of the most important, most moral, most intelligent intellectuals and political leaders in the country. It's a great honor for us to have you with us. And I don't know, but one moment, I want to introduce your wife, Gugu Mhlali, who is also with the Kgalema Motlanthe Foundation. Thank you for being here with us. Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Princeton Lyman, for your warm words of welcome. Ambassador Johnny Carson, Ambassador George Goose, Pauline, yes, and Stephen, Tom. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to address you this afternoon. It is a great honor and a privilege to be in such esteemed company and among those for whom South Africa and Africa is a place of keen interest and studied observance. No doubt many of you are experts on matters relating to South Africa and are therefore cognizant of the country's socio-politics, history, current affairs, and its place in the continent of Africa. I take this expertise into account as I briefly address you today on the prevailing issues in my country and the governing party, that is the African National Congress, that have bearing on South Africa's position on the continent and within wider international affairs. These are issues about which there have been increasing vocality given the present leadership crisis that casts a shadow over our country. It is meaningful that we find ourselves at the United States Institute for Peace as the values represented by this non-partisan independent institution converge with the democratic aims of South Africa that are enshrined in our Constitution. This institute and those who labor under its injunction, like those of us who have chosen a life of public service, understand that we are always in service of the people and our government and our countries, and as such have been entrusted with a significant task that should not be taken lightly nor transgressed. The promotion of peace, both internal and external, is at the heart of democratic ideals. In fact, peace is a precondition for any development. In the early 1990s, the peaceful attainment of democracy in our transitioning country seemed elusive at best and impossible at worst. It was considered doubtful that we would achieve our transition without bloodshed and civil war. However, democracy was realized without much of the doomsday prophecies coming to pass. As such, those who hold high levels of trust, public office, and power of various kinds, and have a moral and ethical obligation to ensure that we remain in fidelity to our hard-won democracy. It is no secret that some among those entrusted with leadership within our present government appear to be focused on vested interests than the welfare of the nation. As such, they need to be held accountable under the demands of our legal system and in accordance with the codes of morality and ethics that underscore public office. Many key public figures and powerful institutions, such as the late Ahmed Kathrada and the foundation that bears his name, and the Nelson Mandela Foundation, as well as public intellectuals, have spoken out against the culture of venality in the public sphere. Such acts of speaking truth to power are evidence of democracy at work. Those who are concerned about current South African affairs should note that there are strong checks and balances to ensure accountability, whether through the separation of powers, our firm legal system, or our Constitution and Bill of Rights. There are institutions and systems in place to preserve our democracy and address present socio-economic and historical challenges as we strive to realize a united, democratic, non-racial, non-sexist, just and prosperous nation. In considering this, however, one cannot ignore recent events which have given many anxieties about our economy going forward, which include shifts in our cabinet and a downgrade to junk status by investment agencies. Investors need to know that South Africa remains a stable and predictable investment outlet even during fluid and uncertain political times, as proven by its efficacious response to the 2008 world economic crisis. I say this cognizant of the fact that, like many countries in the developing South, we need to prove our worth on a number of socio-economic indicators, such as political stability, cultivating an investment-friendly environment, greening the economy, transparency, predictability, as well as firm macroeconomic policies. The current state of affairs is survivable, and it is unlikely that we will slide into a state that is beyond redress. The final contours of South Africa's future are rooted in our present post-apartheid efforts. Much else will depend on how successful we are in this construction of a new reality. Primarily, senior leaders within the party should take heed of public criticism. Necessarily, this includes holding the leadership to the highest possible ethical standards. The only sides of protection that require active attention are the people who have entrusted us with power and the democratic republic that we seek to preserve. And to that end, in doing this, we should take heed of the words of President Nelson Mandela, who emphatically stated, and I quote, "The truth is that we are not yet free. We have merely achieved the freedom to be free, the right not to be oppressed. We have not taken the final step of our journey, but the first step on a longer and even more difficult road. The true test of our devotion to freedom is just beginning," close quote. And with those words, I want to thank you for your attention. I hope we will have an interactive session. I'm willing to field questions. I thought that I should be very brief in order to allow you more time to ask me questions about matters that are of more interest. Otherwise, I would have bored you to death with details of how remarkable South Africa is and so on. Yeah. But I would rather hear from you so that I can respond directly to your questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, President Malani, and thank you for your remarks, because they were very, very important. Let me take the liberty of asking the first question, if you don't mind. And the question, let me put it bluntly, what happened to the ANC? I had the privilege of being in South Africa, as you know, during the years of 92 to 95 there for the magnificent transition, the emotion of the voting in 94, the first year of Nelson Mandela's presidency. And there were skeptics. There were people like R.W. Johnson and others who said, yeah, but the ANC will soon fall into a pattern of corruption, etc. Don't have your hopes up. And I was one of those who argued, no, it wouldn't happen, because there was a great deal of principle behind the ANC. And it showed up in the Constitution that was developed, which is one of the strongest democratic constitutions anywhere. But something did happen over the years. My own view is that it started even with the arms deal that happened. But over time, the ANC fell into patterns, some corruption, and then protecting itself from transparency and accountability. And the reason I asked the question about what's happened to it over time is it possible even then to regenerate it, to come back to that spirit?
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador, for your question. For 82 years, the ANC was an organization which pursued the struggle against apartheid, a system based on racial discrimination. And so those and you know, for 82 years it did that as a legal organization in South Africa. But in 1960, in the wake of the Sharpeville massacre, it was banned together with the Pan-Africanist Congress. And so, in the words of Nelson Mandela at that time, 1960, when it was banned, he said, there comes a time in the life of every nation when the choice is either to submit or to fight. And that the African people choose to fight. And so the new structures had to be established to function underground as illicit structures. And Lily's Leaf was the place of safety where the leaders had to work out how to respond to the fact that the authorities were now treating the ANC as a proscribed organization. And the people who, for 30 years, from 1960 to 1991, joined the ANC's struggle, expected no other form of reward other than the elimination of apartheid as an obnoxious system. And so these are men and women who were, again, in the words of Nelson Mandela at the Rivonia trial, were prepared, if needs be, to die for freedom. Now, post-1994, when now the ANC became a governing party, many other people joined the ANC. The old hands in the ANC were now in charge of government, and therefore in a position to dispense with lucrative contracts and so on. And so we had reached a different time altogether. And by maintaining the ANC as a liberation organization, we fell prey to the temptations of power. I think one of the greatest sayings and quotes is from Benjamin Franklin, I think, who said, nearly all men can withstand adversity, but
if you want to know a man's true character, give him power. And so we ended up with power in our hands, and as they say, power corrupts. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. So we noticed that as early as the year 2000, we did an appraisal of the ANC and came to a conclusion that even as the ANC was leading the process of transformation in South Africa, it was itself being transformed in a manner that it had no control over, because power and the authority to dispense with and to adjudicate over contracts and so on meant that very few of our people were prepared by the history of struggle and sacrifice to know how to deal with gifts, because the frontline soldiers of corruption are gifts, actually. That's when you're a public servant and you are exposed to certain information. And that information, if it is used for any other means other than what it is meant for, that's the beginning of corruption. And so someone might come and, leave free tickets for a rugby match or a football match without asking for any favor in return. And so with time, one day, that same person would be at the back of a long queue, and all they have to do is to greet you. That remember, I'm the one who left the, and therein lies the rot, you see. So once you don't have the experience and the training of people who serve in the public service on how to deal with gifts, what to do, what should be their attitude, they are likely to be corrupted in the process. Yeah.
And can it regenerate itself?
That's a moot question that's been debated now in the country, that there's need for renewal. In fact, in 2000, when we did a self-appraisal, we came to the same conclusion, that we need the renewal of the organization. But, it's very difficult when you are having to do that to yourselves without really, going through a surgical overhaul, because the tendency is to try and preserve as much as your past dictates, because remember the struggle itself has happened and passed. But so you tend to look backwards because your glorious efforts are in the past. Whereas one of our poets, Professor Piorapet Khositsile, has a lovely poem, and in it has a line where he writes the words past, present, future as one word. And he says past, present, future is always now. So it's very difficult. You can't separate the past completely from the present, and you can't focus in the past if you are to create the future. So past, present, future is always now. Means that the past will continually cast its shadow on the present, but that the present must always be alive to the need to lay down a solid foundation for the future. So as a liberation movement, the tendency would be to romanticize and glorify the past, so you look backwards. And with time, you completely lose connection. Your language, your vocabulary belongs to the past, and younger people cannot relate to that. And so if you get disconnected from the younger generation, then there's no tomorrow, there's no future. So the need for renewal of the organization is there. But whether it can happen in a managed fashion or it's something that must be instilled by the privilege to be in opposition's benches. Because as a governing party, you develop certain mannerisms. I mean, right now in South Africa, the project, which was a noble project of understanding that our task is to unite South Africans and to deepen democracy, do it in a non-racial fashion and a non-sexist manner. That task now is being pushed to the back burner because the narrative nationally is that we alone liberated you. And so you have no right to hold any view on any matter. Yours is to listen and to hear from us. We know what's good for you. And that narrative undermines the effort of uniting South Africans. So the old fault lines that divided us in the past are now gaining prominence. So I know it's a long-winded answer to
it's
a very simple question of whether renewal is possible or not.
Right.
So I'm saying we've been aware of the need for it from 2000, and even now we're still tweaking the formulations that we came up with in 2000, and so. Last year, we lost a number of important metropolitan municipalities in local government elections, and that, in a sense, jolted us to try and be a bit more sincere about the need to renew ourselves. But even that doesn't seem to, because once, in the wake of such a defeat, it becomes urgent, but with time, we fall back to the same old routine and groove of how we know how to exist here.
Let me ask one other question, that I'm going to open it up, because it relates a little bit to this, but to something else. As you know, and you've mentioned this before, the young people who are voting, who will vote in the next election, were not there in 1994, and that's history to them. To some, it's important history, but to some, it's not their history, and their attitudes might be very different. But and you can't, obviously, it's hard to generalize about a whole generation of young people, but you've got, it seems to me, a cadre that has had good education, et cetera, in the universities. You have a large cadre who have not, and the unemployment. where do they fit in the political system? Are they engaged? Are they more sympathetic to the economic freedom fighters? Are they apathetic? Are they still looking to where? And are the parties really able to engage and reach this young generation?
Well, the economic freedom fighters call a spade a spade. They lack sophistry, and so, you know, if they have a concern, they state it for what it is, and that finds lots of resonance among young people, particularly those young people who are at university level, who are now reading Frantz Fanon's works and so on, and so
rite of passage, yes.
Yeah, and so they actually believe that you know, the settlement that led to a peaceful resolution of the problem of apartheid was a sold-out deal. And it's a completely ahistorical approach, because the liberation movement fought a struggle for liberation, and in relays, the baton should be passed on to the younger generation, you know, to take things forward. But if a relay, the baton is not passed on to the next athlete, that team will lose, of course. You see, so they have no sentimental attachment to the history, and that makes it this much more difficult for, as I said, even the vocabulary, even the language that we use in the ANC. It's a language that we are not familiar with, and because we are not creating the space for them as younger people. When we were young and our hearts were full of fire, it was the older leaders who gave us responsibility. That's how they trained us. And you can't expect young people to behave responsibly unless you give them responsibility. So that's what's happening to us, and that's hence the disconnect between ourselves and the younger generation.
Well, I could ask a lot more questions, but we have a nice, very educated audience, and I will ask you please to identify yourself and keep it to a question so we can get to everybody. Let's start with the gentleman there, and then I'll go to the lady there, and then the other lady.
Who's on the mic for?
Do we have someone with a mic?
We do, yeah. Here.
Ah, yes, we do. Thank you.
Two brief questions. Nicholas Cook at the Congressional Research Service. So first, you recently said that the ANC MPs are not hirelings of the leadership and of the party, and that they have the full constitutional right to vote their conscience under the ANC Constitution. But as we know, this government plays hardball and expedient politics, and the possibility of retribution or loss of those MP seats is a reality. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the pros and cons of a secret vote in the no confidence issue. And then one other quick question. A radical economic transformation is a policy of the ANC, but there are, of course, various interpretations of that. And I'm wondering how you would distinguish between the radical economic transformation that Minister Gigaba, the new finance minister, might pursue as compared to that Mcebisi Jonas and Pravin Gordon might have followed. Thank you.
That's two heavy questions.
Okay. All right. Yes, Nicholas, our electoral system is based on proportional representation. So it is not individuals who contest elections, but parties. And so once a party has won a number of seats, it follows its own internal processes of compiling a list of people who must then occupy those seats in the legislature. So, and as public representatives, MPs do take an oath, which oath says they will, follow the Constitution of the Republic. But they are sent there by parties. And the constitution of these parties, I know this from the ANC side, are not aligned to the Constitution of the Republic as the supreme law of the country. So you send members out, they take an oath, but you govern them in terms of your own constitution, which is not aligned to the Constitution of the Republic. Therein lies a misalignment. Then, you see, when a president is being elected, it's by secret ballot. And when the Speaker of the National Assembly is elected, it's by secret ballot. And when you are electing someone, you do so as happy campers. We might as well do it by show of hand, but it's by secret ballot. And yet, a vote of no confidence and impeachment procedures, the Constitution is silent on that aspect. But of course, the rules of Parliament do give the Speaker the discretion to decide on those matters. But the Speaker now currently is opposing an application by opposition parties for the vote of no confidence to be dealt with by secret ballot. And the President has joined that action by the Speaker in opposition to that. Now, even if the ANC were to say, let this be by secret ballot, nothing stops the ANC from speaking to its own members of Parliament and persuading them to vote in whatever manner they decide. Nothing. But to actually take a stance where you oppose secret ballot, firstly, you convey the message that you have no confidence in your own members. So you convey a message that you are gripped by fear, and that dents the prestige of the party in the eyes of ordinary people. So that matter is sub judice, it's before the courts. The courts are still to make a determination as to whether they remind the Speaker that, yes, you do have the discretion. Please, Speaker, Honorable Speaker, take a stand on this matter. So the vote of confidence has been postponed until the courts make a determination on that matter. The anticipation is that the courts will make a determination in the next week or two. Yes. And then that, whichever way that goes, the matter would be attended to in that fashion. Yeah. The radical economic transformation, if you go through the policy resolutions and documents of the ANC to date, you will not find that term in those documents. It's not there. It's a term that's been used because there has been a report by the public protector, the previous public protector, Ms. Tuli Madonsela, Advocate Madonsela, which refers to state capture. And it's really about contracts of parastatals and so on, and how those are allocated to people without due process. So, to create a counter-narrative, this notion of radical economic transformation has now been thrown into national discourse. And essentially, when you dig deeper as to what is meant by that, because it's coupled with another notion of white monopoly capitalism. So if black people are involved in obtaining opportunities through means that are not quite lawful, don't bother, that's small matters. Focus on the big matters of how the economy is monopolized by whites. Yeah. Now, there's a logic in them, there's some logic in that madness, but that's what it is here. But if you go through the policy documents, the resolutions of conferences, you will not find that.
Lady right here.
Dr. Christina, czekam z World Peace Organization. South Africa, your motivation, first of all, to get freedom was totally different. And you are in a kind of transition state to obtain self-organization for prosperity. I'm pretty sure they will achieve a target, but it will take a time and to make your country competitive with the whole world. But what I'm interested is that you are such a fantastic, huge continent. Why don't you create one international organization for the peace guarantee? Because there's so many wars in Africa, and it's said this conscience should be born.
Thank you. And if I could add to that, Mr. President, recently South Africa hasn't played as strong a role in the African Union as it did some years ago. So in relationship to not only continent-wide effort on peace, where is South Africa's role on the continent, and where should it be going?
Firstly, the continent is organized as the African Union. And the African Union itself is divided into regional economic communities. So you'll find ECOWAS in the northwest, and you find East Africa Economic Community in the east, and you find the Central Africa Economic Community, which has members straddling between the east and central. Then you have SADC in the south. These are regional economic communities. And the idea is that, they should serve as building blocks in terms of creating interconnectivity among, the region, regional member states, and trying to promote intra-trade regionally in that fashion. All of this is hampered by underdevelopment of infrastructure, the road infrastructure, the rail infrastructure. It still takes an inordinate amount of time for goods and people to go across borders on the continent of Africa. In terms of the AU principles, firstly, it was agreed that no person or group of persons who assume power over any country outside of democratic means would be recognized. So that had the effect of reducing coup d'etats in Africa. But of course, there's still cases where a coup d'etat is staged and the soldiers doff their uniforms and their leader wears a pinstripe suit and calls a sham election, and the soldiers go and line up everybody to vote for the leader. And then you have, those who firstly were involved in organizing a coup now becoming legitimized through sham elections. The AU, from time to time in certain areas, does pull together peacekeeping units which work hand in glove with the UN peacekeepers. So that's what the AU does. There is even an African peer review mechanism where sister countries assess each other quite rigorously and honestly. So the African peer review mechanism works fairly well. But of course, the problem is that the leaders of such countries that have been so assessed can ignore the report, can file it as a good report and simply do nothing about it. There is no enforcement mechanism of the recommendations of the African peer review committees. Yeah.
Which means the self-organization needs to be improved.
Yes, it has to improve. It also calls for commitment by member states and acceptance of the recommendations.
Woman right there, yes. Could we get a microphone there? Thank you. And I'll move out to other parts.
Okay, thank you. Mr. President, it's really an honor to see you today, and thank you so much for coming. I'd like to follow up on sorry, my name is Lisa Gomer. I'm former United Nations and USAID, and I wanted to follow up on the question that you started with about what happened to the ANC. I want to look at what's happening to the ANC right now. I find it very disturbing that there's a series of the corruption is very much out in the open. You had the municipal elections, which you referred to last year, which was a huge blow. You have the whole trying to block the special prosecutors or special protectors report. You have Kasatu Communist Party denouncing the current administration, and people in the streets of all colors and members of South Africa. And yet the ANC Executive Committee, or I'm not sure exactly who are responsible, are paralyzed. That's what I want to understand, because there have to be people like you who care about the credibility of democracy in your country in the future. So that's my one question. And then the follow with that is, next year are presidential elections. Do you think that there will be true democracy and a real election next year? Thank you.
In South Africa, the next elections are in 2019.
Oh, sorry, 19.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, the biggest challenge facing the ANC now is that the elected structures of leadership The ANC is structured from national, provincial, regional, and at local level branch. And each one of those structures, at branch level, that's where every member has a right to participate in the political life of the organization. And so in a members' general meeting, they elect a branch executive committee. So from branch executive committees, regional executive committees, provincial executive committees to the national executive committee, these are structures of elected leadership, which were elected to coordinate and lead the activities of the general membership, which is the organization. But what has happened is over the years, these elected structures of leadership have substituted themselves for the general organization. So at branch level, general members' meetings are never convened. So each time there's an internal process, the people who are likely to participate starts from the branch executive to upwards. Now, that has the effect of paralyzing the organization because just by exclusion, basically, except when there is a conference, then people can be handpicked on the basis of allegiance and support. So the vibrancy of the organization is gone because it really was a function of the ideas and inputs of members. Now it's confined to leaders, to the exclusion of members. And this is what paralyzes the ANC. At a local level, you may have a community which has concerns about services, and there's a branch of the ANC in that community, and the ANC will not know until it sees on television that there are and the members of the ANC would be participating there. So it's a situation whereby, generally speaking, the people of South Africa will not wait for the ANC to come back. They will move on, even as the ANC is increasingly looking inwards and being, preoccupied with internal issues. South Africans are moving forward. By the time the ANC opens up, it may be too late.
And the election?
Well, the elections, we have an independent electoral commission, which is truly independent and completely incorruptible. So elections are organized and conducted in a very transparent manner because from each voting station, each party that is contesting elections would have party representatives there. So they can count for themselves. They are there when the count is done, and they can collate and tally their own votes. So it's very difficult for...
I didn't mean that. I meant who the ANC will put up as their candidate. Is it going to be just a continuation of the same, or is it going to be at that point, do you think there's a chance at that point in time to make a real change so that there'll be a true new start, so to speak? That's a very important issue.
Well, the ANC is due to convene its elective conference at the end of this year, in December of this year, where the leadership of the ANC would be elected. All we are praying for is, it should be an honest group of people. That's all. Yeah, we'll be very happy if,
There's someone at the very back row. There. Okay, and then I'll try and get as many as I can.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Julian Kyle Lewis. I study international education policy at the American University here in D.C. My question is, due to our recent presidential election here in the United States, we have President Trump now, and he's a big champion of switching around some of our trade agreements and trade relations and things of that nature, being the businessman that he has proven himself to be. And my question for you is, what do you think about the big conferences and power meetings that have been taking place after this president's election, where they're inviting trade leaders and representatives from every nation around the world except leaders from the nations in Africa to discuss the trade that will go on inside of Africa? Thank you very much.
Well, you know, the AU crafted what was called NEPAT as a basis for Africa's approach of negotiating terms of trade with European countries as well as the United States of America. But, you know, the continent is together politically. And because of mainly underdeveloped infrastructure which connects countries across the continent, because for many centuries the continent was used for extraction of raw material. So if you look at the rail infrastructure in the continent, it is from source to port. Source to port, and there's never any, you know, interconnectivity there. That makes it difficult even today, because those that kind of infrastructure remains underdeveloped. A few years ago, the AU agreed to focus primarily on that challenge of creating interconnectivity in terms of infrastructure. But, you know, the AU is headed by heads of states and governments. So in that summit, when they are to select projects, each president, you know, thinks of a pet project. And so there's still poor planning, because they plan without data. So there's still poor planning at that level, which only hampers, you know, the efforts of creating the conditions for intra-trade in the continent. The population of the continent is plus 1 billion people. And it's a huge market if looked at together. But, you know, both the AU and the regional economic communities I've alluded to also enter into bilateral trade agreements individually. The Republic of China, People's Republic of China, go to a country like Angola, and when it is faced by the challenge of repairing the infrastructure following the civil war, so that 3 rail lines that needed to be rehabilitated. So the Chinese government goes there with $2 billion in the back, and they ask them, how can we be of help to you? So the Angolans agree that, well, we would love to have these 3 rail lines rehabilitated. And they tick off, so the Chinese say, wonderful, we'll do that for you. But what the Chinese insist on is that they will provide 70% of the labor. and the Angolans should provide the remaining 30% of labor in that whole project. And they then, because they are in charge, so they use the platoon system. Platoon system means that they do 3 continuous operation shifts. So they work 24 hours on a project. And the Angolans are not used to working like that. They are used to a normal shift, 8-hour working day, and you are off. Huh? So the 30% desert, and the Chinese don't complain, they just replace them with more Chinese. That's the plight of, in other words, I'm using this example to show you how skewed the, balance of forces really is there. So the Angolans end up accepting. And they go out into the provinces to create infrastructure and more housing for the war displacees, people who left their villages. So they go back, there's an infrastructure. But of course the Chinese open the trading stores and everything. That's what happens. Yeah. Okay.
Let's see, I get over to this side. Gentleman in the yellow jacket, yellowish jacket.
I'm Wally Mutazemil, and I'm alumni of the USIP.
Can you be a little louder? It's hard to hear. I don't know if it's on or not.
You can use this. Wally Mutazemil, USIP alumni, Democracy from War to Peace. Also, I'd like to thank you, Mr. President, for your honesty and being very candid. My question is about the ideal of transformation, specifically in the area of the AIC. And it is a possibility. It's a field that I've been working in for over 30 years, specifically in the area of Malaysia, working with the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Dr. Mahathir. So I like to speak with optimism, and it is a probability. I also like to speak with terms of research. There's a gentleman did his dissertation on assessment and evaluation of reconciliation over the last 20 years of all reconciliations that have been done in the world. And looking at the various areas of what has happened from donor organizations, if we look at financing, administration, security, and training, what has happened in those various codes and categories, there's been zero in terms of donor organizations in the last 20 years in all reconciliations around the world in terms of focusing on training people who come out of reconciliation to train, to transform what they've been living for the last, what we call past-based conversations for the last 30 years. They've done nothing in terms of investment. So when you go to the table and becoming new future-based conversations, you still have those same ways and means, those same ways of thinking, those same ways of being. When you go to the new future-based conversation, you're the same people that you've been for the last 40 years. And so we do have, excuse me, sir. Yeah, excuse me, sir. I'm making a point here.
Yeah, I understand.
And the point is, you're going to get my question, Ambassador. And the question is that if there's a willingness for a request, we have people such as the Transformation Leadership Council They've been doing this work for over 40 years around the world. This is where Dr. Mahathir and President Mandela came out of prison. The South-South relationship, which you are aware of, he was the father of development because of what he was able to accomplish, because he requested members from the Transformation Leadership Council to come and help that nation transform itself. And the question is that if there's a willingness for the request, yes, the leaders, the ANC, the nation can learn how to transform itself from what it may have been doing for the last 40 years. But there has to be a request to say, I want to learn. I want to learn. So that's the question, is that if you want to learn how to be a different type of visionary leader, you can do that, but there must be a request. I want to learn how to be different in the 21st century.
We got the question.
So in terms of the Chinese,
excuse me,
when the Chinese came to Malaysia,
we got a lot of people want to talk, so let's go to that question and then we'll go on.
It's a force-feed in workforce development.
Yeah.
When they came to Malaysia, it was a 51%.
I'm awfully sorry, but we really have to let him answer and move on to other questions. Please, please, sir.
Or the people in the main country so they can develop entrepreneurial workforce development rather than separate areas. That's a force feed that they want in Africa. So there is a different way to do business on that first.
Thank you.
You sure can.
Thank you.
Sorry. But
Well, thank you very much, Wally. I couldn't agree more with you that if you know what you don't know, you ask. So there must be a request on that basis. But firstly, you must know what you don't know. The conceit, you see, conceit leads to complacency. And when you have, a leader like Mahathir was able to introduce Bhumatra system because he was aware of, the limitations of the Malaysian people. He, I recall, set as a target 30%. He said he would want the economy of Malaysia, 30% of it, to be owned by Malaysian nationals. And he then, set processes in motion towards the attainment of that target. At the time of his retirement, he berated the Malaysian people because he said they make no difference between money and assets, and that their love for money made them get rid of assets very easily, because he made a determination that at that point they had only reached the target of 19 instead of 30. And he expressed deep disappointment at that time. But I couldn't agree more with you about, the need to request for, assistance in terms of transformation.
Let me ask you if I can. The problem you raised before that agitates some parts of the population, and that is that there still is a feeling that you have white capitalism, that the majority population is still there's a great income divide and there's an ownership divide, and whether you call it radical transformation or other thing. What have been the obstacles, education, what is it, policy, that more hasn't been accomplished in changing that dynamic? Because it seems to be driving at least some of the unhappiness and unrest in the performance of the government since 1994.
Well, one of the biggest weaknesses in South Africa, which does not exist anywhere else on the African continent, is that in South Africa there was a law passed in 1913 called the Native Land Act, which excluded Africans from holding title deeds for any piece of property. They were given worthless certificates called permission to occupy, which did not serve as commercial instruments. You couldn't use them, as an asset and so on. So that still remains the problem up to this day, and that is why there's a growing call for land to be returned to the people. But of course, the general discourse around that issue is also, befuddled by the fact that people want to use history for that. And when you claim pre-colonial land, it's very difficult because you're going to find that hunter-gatherers covered large tracts of land. So I happen to serve on a panel that was established by the Speakers Forums at the end of 2015. And one of the issues we're looking at is this issue of land. Reform, distribution, redistribution, and tenure of security. And it's very clear to, because we've called for written submissions, we've organized roundtables with experts on this question. There are no cadastral registers, for instance, of, who owns which part of the land. But it's very clear that parastatals own lots of land in South Africa. And if we were to address it, properly, we need that data. It's a matter that must be addressed with the data so that we can, ensure that people get title, and because the exclusion or the denial of Africans of title deeds meant that they were actually excluded from the main economy of the country. Now, some of the political questions relate to whether title deeds should be issued to households or to individuals. This is a moral question, of course, because some people say if you give it to an individual and the individual is a gambler, he'll gamble it away. The family would be hard up. But if you give it to a household, it means if they are to drill a borehole on that property, they must have a consensus. Everyone must agree to it. So morally, these questions arise, but it's something that if we think of title deed as a commercial instrument, which would enable people to at least have assets, that would be the best and most effective way of empowering people. There's been attempts at what we call broad black economic empowerment, but that's dilution. You see, what happens is in the first phase thereof, and it was started in the mining industry, the companies would offer equity shares on a discounted basis, but it is debt funded, you see. So when the commodity prices rise, the possibility exists of the rights being paid off. But once they take a dip, that's it, they disappear. So we've gone through phases of that, and many people are unhappy because, anyway, the way the system works is that it necessarily will empower a handful of people to the exclusion of the majority, and so the political questions then arise as a consequence of that. Yeah.
Let's see, lady at the back there. Yes, right there. Oh, good.
Nuts and bolts question.
Identify yourself, please.
Okay, Arlene, I'm from, my husband worked for UNESCO, and we visited South Africa, Cape Town, and I think 2/3 of the population of South Africa lives in townships. Is that correct? 2/3? And what I saw in the townships, I went on a tour through the townships, and lack of electricity and lack of proper sanitation, and I couldn't help but think, to move forward, these townships have to be addressed first in the country. I mean, if that's where 2/3 of the population lives, is in townships. And my question is, why can't we, South Africa, build the same types of apartment community dwellings as they do in China? China does it so well. I know in Africa, land is a big thing, but what I saw with the land was barefoot children running around areas of ravines with trash and electricity that was stolen from other electricity and other buildings, and it just, if there was electricity, and I just felt like, why isn't this being addressed? These people have been living like this for decades and decades, and why isn't that being addressed? I mean, what now, today, if that could change?
Yeah. Well, South Africa is made up of two countries in within the same borders. The townships were essentially labor camps. I don't know if you know about the pass system. There was influx control laws which essentially forced people to only live in the townships for as long as they are, employed by specific companies and so on. So, post-1994, the education system has now been systematically, there were 5 different systems of education. For the Africans, there's a system called Bantu education, which was introduced in 1954. And when Dr. Verwoerd introduced it, he said it's specific, and they engineered it by taking over teacher training colleges and aiming to produce particular cohort and caliber of teachers, which would be very poor in mathematics and natural sciences. And the main purpose was that it's a unique system. It was a unique system in the world because education is meant to make sure that its products become productive in the economy. But this one was specifically aimed at ensuring that its products would not be productive in the economy. Because Dr. Verwoerd said there's no point in doing that for the black child. Black child must only be taught to understand that their place in life will not go beyond certain levels of manual labor. Now, that remains a dead weight today. We have not been able from 1994 to do exactly what Dr. Verwoerd did, but with the aim of producing better teachers who will produce citizens who will be productive in the economy. We haven't been able to do that. So electricity has been rolled out across the length and breadth of the country. Villages and townships are all electrified now. Water it's potable water is available, but there are certain parts that are still lacking, where people still draw water from the river, where people have no proper sewer system in the township. So the two countries I'm talking about is that the one part of South Africa has been able to host international events, be it conferences or sports events and so on, including rugby, international rugby tournaments, international soccer tournaments, and so on. So there's infrastructure that is so developed that it compares favorably with first world infrastructure. But there's communities who are without sewer system, where, I mean, I remember going into a school, in a well-built school, Madiba, Nelson Mandela raised money, and they built this high school in the rural village. But because they have no bulk water supply, they don't have flushing toilets. And so both the teachers and the learners literally have to go into the bush outside the school premises to relieve themselves. This is the disparity that still exists in South Africa. Your question is, why has that not been addressed? Firstly, we're struggling, even with urban areas where infrastructure is in place. In the municipalities, we don't have the right engineers. The older engineers would have retired and left. So we have municipalities that are led by municipality councils and mayors, but with no technical skills to understand the infrastructure and how old it is and how it should be maintained or renewed and replaced at a particular time. So the challenge really of modernizing South Africa, that's how I put it, by ensuring that this backward section is provided with infrastructure that matches the infrastructure in the urban areas. Before Bantu education was introduced in 1954, education in South Africa was the responsibility of missionaries. So it's church denominations which provided education in the schools and training of teachers. And when Bantu education was introduced, the missionaries were elbowed out of education in the African communities only. So in the white communities, they continued to provide education, with the result that today, if you go to South Africa, the best schools, private schools, are schools which were missionary schools for white children. Mm-hmm. But those in the African townships were shut down. So that's the story of our life in South Africa. And these are the issues that from time to time give rise to protests, precisely because young people feel that they deserve to have access to the same infrastructure.
Mr. President, can I, we're drawing to a close, and I want to ask about U.S.-South Africa relations. We have a binational commission, and at the binational commission, our Secretary of State and your foreign minister say relations are good, but they're really not. Okay. They have been less than cordial in some degree. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of collaboration, not a lot of agreement on either regional issues or broad
issues, some nasty words traded back and forth. It's not the relationship that people anticipated. Some of it is substantive, some of it is not. And we're going into this period where there's going to be quite a little political turmoil in South Africa. I don't mean physically turmoil, but political turmoil. What do you see about this relationship? Why is it not good? Because it isn't. And what can be done, what should be done on both parts to construct a more effective relationship?
Well, you know, relations between countries are best served when you have people-to-people relations to start with, so that government-to-government relations have a solid base where, you know, people are, you know, exchanges are happening at that level. Because if that doesn't happen, then, you know, minor differences can on specific matters can scupper major
frozen chickens.
Yes. So I know we have a binational with the government of the United States of America, and it is coordinated at the level of the deputy presidents. You know, when I served as deputy president, we had a very positive relationship with Vice President Joe Biden, and you know, we were able to attend to difficult matters and resolve them through discussions, and we ensured that every year we hold a binational that we host in South Africa, and the next year Vice President Joe Biden would host a binational here in the United States of America. Now, we have more than 600 American companies, corporate companies in South Africa. They are organized into the American Chamber of Commerce. I think, you know, the American ambassador to South Africa already has a base in terms of the American Chamber of Commerce in South Africa. Those are people who do business in South Africa, and it's important to ensure that we cement the relationship even at that level, because those are the pillars that would ensure that the bilateral relations remain solid and unshakable, even when there appears to be fluidity in the political situations. Therefore, the trade agreements, you know, can be debated and entered into properly. I remember a few years ago, Walmart came to South Africa and did a, you know, feasibility study, and at the end, 2 cabinet ministers took Walmart to the Competitions Commission. We have a Competitions Commission because Walmart was at the same time entering into a measure with a local Massmart, was a local South African company in the commercial sector, and because the fears of these ministers, the Minister of Trade and Industry as well as the Minister of Economic Development, were that Walmart was going to form a monopoly. So it's an antitrust. The Competitions Commission is an antitrust structure, and one of the things that persuaded them to approve that measure, as well as allowing Walmart to operate in South Africa, was that, you know, they were they took into consideration the fact that by size, South African corporations are small. And therefore, if they are to grow and to become world players, they need to merge with other, corporations globally. But in the same breath, they also were aware that, South African corporations, purely and simply because of their size, are also sitting ducks for hostile takeovers. And that's why the procedure is that they have to give approval.
Well, it's something I think both countries have to work on, because it has not been. But I'm sorry, we have run to the end of our time. I know there were more questions out there, but President Matlana, you have been extraordinarily candid, open, educational, and we are very grateful for your being here. We wish you every luck and success and luck in South Africa. So please join me in thanking.
Thank you.